Wizard, and today we're going to continue our series on Hegel. So I'm going to recap what we talked about in the last section, part 18, sections 40 to 42 of the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. My description of that section was as follows. Hegel starts this section talking about how dogma underlies a lot of our knowledge, not just religious dogma, but scientific, where we hold certain assumptions to be true for the sake of building some structure to the subject. Though this seems unnecessary, Hegel seems to think otherwise, proclaiming dogma to be endemic to grasping actual knowledge. He notes that historical truth is often simple and factual, but the interpretations we glean and how we contextualize facts is where the realm of true knowledge lies. We then delve into a conversation about mathematics and how it also requires us to externalize the essence and internalize the existence if we hope to truly understand these proofs and concepts. So very kind of well written there. I surprised myself. Let's see what Dr. Sadler put for his. Let me pull it up here. All right. Dr. Sadler said he summarized the last section as he begins by briefly exploring what dogmatic thinking consists in, okay, yeah, and then examines the status of historical truths, discussing what degree of necessity or scientific perspective historical inquiry can involve. He then begins what will be a long discussion of the status of mathematical truths, mathematical modes of cognition, and how mathematics, the discipline and approach held out as the preeminent one in early modernity, does not really lead us into the heart of the phenomenon, as philosophical cognition does. Mm, yeah. So, super curious to see, to get into depth about this section and maths and, how that relates to philosophy and so on and so forth. So, without further ado, let us, there we go, begin.
In mathematical cognition, insight is an activity external to the thing. It follows that the true thing is altered by it. The means employed, construction and proof, no doubt contain true propositions, but it must nonetheless be said that the content is false.
Hmm.
In the above example, the triangle is dismembered and its parts consigned to other figures, whose origin is allowed by the construction upon the triangle. Only at the end is the triangle we are actually dealing with reinstated. During the procedure it was lost to view, appearing only in fragments belonging to other figures. Here then we see the negativity of the content coming in as well. This could just as much have been called the falsity of the content as is the disappearance of supposedly fixed conceptions in the movement of the notion.
Hmm. I suppose they're gonna have some visuals that will help
When
us
you're
with it.
reading the Phenomenology and you're looking at Hegel's rather lengthy and sustained critique of what he calls mathematical cognition, or Kennen, the way, not so much of doing mathematics per se as a discipline, but the way of using mathematics to understand reality as a tool, as a mode of grasping things and making sense out of them, as in many cases something that would be like a last appeal. You could appeal to the mathematics or something. There's a few things to keep in mind. One that's very important is that in section 43 and 44, he's kind of fencing around. He's not actually getting to what he's going to lay out on the table for us in section 45. So you've got to be a little bit patient with him. The other thing that for me comes to mind, as somebody who actually had an undergraduate degree not only in philosophy but in mathematics, and who did a lot of work with logic and the foundations of mathematics, is that when you're reading his criticisms, there's a kind of unfamiliarity that occurs on your part, where you're like, I'm not quite sure what he's referring to here, and this
Yeah.
doesn't seem quite right. It's important to remember that he is understanding mathematics in terms of the mathematics available to the well-educated person of his own time, that advances have been made within the discipline and in the self-understanding of mathematics that Hegel didn't have access to, but which he could have assimilated. We're not going to try to make sense of that here, because that goes a little bit outside of the scope of the text, which is already long and difficult enough. So let's look at section
This is the one part that
43
didn't
itself.
age well, maybe.
He says, in mathematical cognition, insight is an activity external to the thing. It follows that the true thing is altered by it. And the word that he's using for thing is Sache. So you can understand that as not just thing, like a tangible thing, but the matter, what it is that we're trying to make sense of. And what does he mean by external? That seems kind of a strange thing to say, given that when we think about mathematical modeling, for example, or making sense of something through mathematics, we don't think of that in terms of something external to what it is that we're studying. Instead, we often think about it, and this is the way many people thought of it at the time, as sort of revealing the structure, revealing the internality of it. Now, within Hegelian philosophy, internality is going to be something dynamic, and that's why mathematics is going to be something external. Another thing that's missing in this passage, but on the explicit level, but is implicit, that we want to make sense of, he's talking about mathematics and its relationship to the thing. And he says that mathematics uses two means in particular: construction, which we would nowadays call something like application. There is still the term construction, but what he's meaning by that is a little bit broader. And then proof, or beweis, and the deductive process. Mathematics itself is using these as a means, but mathematics is itself a means for the knowing subject to acquire cognition of the thing. And remember, we're always talking about a dynamic reflexive process where cognition is also of the subject and its relation to the thing. So it's not just knowledge of that thing out there, but also knowledge of oneself and one's relation to it. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So mathematics being external means that it's something outside of the knowing subject. It's a discipline. It's a set of techniques, or a technology, if you like, that can be externalized and then can be put into textbooks. You can actually take mathematics. Mathematics is the discipline par excellence that we can in fact make external and say, look, over there's the equations. Over there's the processes. Over there's the proofs.
All right.
Here's your calculus textbook. Here's the theory of limits. Let's take a look at it. So it is external in a certain way. And what he has to say about this, the example that he uses of the triangle and the Pythagorean theorem, it's not the most apt, but you can follow it anyways. He says, in our above example, the triangle is dismembered. It's part.
He says, saw you were live, about to go start dinner, just stopping through to say keep going. Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, definitely will. Are you Eat from the Discord server by any chance? I don't know anybody else with that name, but yeah, thanks for stopping by.
Parts consigned to other figures. What does he mean by that? Well, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. What you're doing then is you're no longer considering the triangle as such. You're considering it by breaking it down. You're analyzing it. You're looking at its relations to other things. You can.
So where did he say this? Did I miss something? I don't know if I should go back. What time? I'm at 6:22. Let me, because I thought he was talking about like a figure, like an image, but it seems he was talking about a specific equation, the Pythagorean theorem. Did he mention that? No, he says in the above example, mathematical cognition may say altered by the means employed, construction improved, no doubt contain true propositions, and then he just says in the above example. So I don't know if Dr. Sadler just forgot to mention that he was talking about like an image here or something, but that's interesting. But I understand that now. 6:22. Okay. And he said, okay, awesome. Says, yes, you are. Hope it contributes to the algorithms. Yeah, I appreciate it. It definitely does. I think. I don't know. Maybe. But I appreciate it nonetheless. Thank you very much.
can consider a squared by itself, you can consider b squared by itself, you can consider the equality relation by itself. And he says, only at the end is the triangle that we're actually dealing with reinstated. And there he's actually got his finger on something important. This probably actually gets to why mathematics is so difficult for many people, and particularly many Americans. When we're dealing with mathematics, we're engaging in abstract thinking, whether we like it or not. And we can do as many, new math or Common Core examples as we like, where we're going to frame it in terms of practical problems. No, mathematics is always, by its very nature, going to be abstract. That's what's great about mathematics. It involves a way of thinking that engages our capacities to do abstractions, to manipulate them. It's a formal discipline. And when we're working with it, what we're doing is we're actually breaking things down and then we're putting them back together. So analysis and synthesis. And Hegel is saying, look, when we're doing that, we actually lose sight of the things. I think that with the Pythagorean theorem, that doesn't really help us so much. Maybe if we're trying to think about measuring, a real-life example, measuring the height of something by looking at its shadow, something along those lines, that could be helpful. But I think that when we're thinking about the applications of mathematics to much more complex issues, or the misapplication of mathematics to things that have to do with our day-to-day lives, our subjectivity, all those sorts of ideas, then his critique that we're losing sight of the thing and that it's getting put back together at the end, it actually has something to it. So the last thing that I want to hit on with this is he says, there's a kind of falsity to this. You can have a proof that actually contains true propositions, but its content is false. Why is its content false? Because you have to abstract from the living, vital, concrete, subjective thing in the process. You can say true things about it and still be doing something that's, in a certain sense, false.
Yeah, that's kind of like the whole point of kind of being abstract, right? It's like you're pointing to something that doesn't really exist, but kind of does exist. This inherent illusion, if you will, that you're kind of messing around with. Like back to my example I was talking about last week with your fingers. Like you have these digits, and for some reason, some point in the past, we were able to ascribe kind of values to these digits, to these appendages, to where we said, okay, these are different, and if I do like this is associated with what we now know as a number 1, 2, 3, 4, right? um and that in itself is an abstraction, because if you say one, okay, one of what? Like what does one mean? There's so many levels of like abstraction has to happen to create language, and then numbers, and it's really interesting when you think about it and when you break it down. But yeah, it's super cool, and I do wish, like, I did enjoy math in school, but I wish it was just done better. um and that there is more causes to use math outside of school. Right now, the only times I really use it is maybe for like design, a little bit of design stuff. If I'm like trying to create, some ratios, golden ratios in design, um, probably it. It's not really much other stuff. I should probably use it, try to figure out more ways to use math in a day-to-day basis, or just play around with it. Maybe go on Brilliant and just look up math stuff, because it really is interesting, and I do want to learn more about it. I've always been interested in like space stuff, and there's a lot of interesting math problems in space related things, dark holes, and trying to predict orbits and all this other stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of utility and beauty.
What is really defective in this kind of cognition concerns the cognitive process itself as well as its material. As regards the former, we do not in the first place see any necessity in the construction. Such necessity does not arise from the notion of the
I'm sorry, it's going a little bit too slow for me reading this.
theorem. It is rather imposed, and the instruction to draw precisely these lines when infinitely many others could be drawn must be blindly obeyed without our knowing anything beyond except that we believe this will be to the purpose in carrying out the proof. In retrospect, this expediency also becomes evident, but it is only an external expediency because it becomes evident only after the proof. This proof, in addition, follows a path that begins somewhere or other without indicating as yet what relation such a beginning will have to the result that will emerge. In its progress, it takes up these particular determinations and relations and lets others alone, without its being immediately clear what the controlling necessity is. An external purpose governs this procedure.
I'm not going to break it down right now.
Section 44 is also very short and
Keep going.
really can be encapsulated, I think, very quickly. There is something important going on there. He says that what's defective about mathematical cognition? He says there's the material, and we've already just looked at that in section 43. Mathematics, in a certain sense, falsifies the very object that it works on in revealing its mathematical sides, you might say, in part by presenting that as if that's what's really essential to it. But it's the cognitive process itself that Hegel is saying is defective in mathematical cognition. We want to ask this question, well, why? And he gives us an explanation. His explanation ends up turning on two terms or concepts that are quite important. One of which is, very closely, paralleled in the translation, necessity, Notwendigkeit. That's a standard, term for necessity, understood in the sense in which we would say it in other languages as well. But then there is another interesting twist. What we're getting here in the Miller translation as expediency is Zweckmäßigkeit. And Zweck means goal or end. So being measured or appropriate to the goal or the end. This is a kind of an interesting thing to point out. There's a little bit of a digression. But when we talk about rationality earlier on in the Phenomenology, he's using that same term, zweckmäßig. Reason proportions itself to certain ends or certain goals. And this notion of end or goal is going to be important in what his critique is here. So let's look at what he's saying. He says, we don't see any necessity in mathematical constructions. And in a certain sense, it's almost a red herring here. He says, look, if you have to make a mathematical construction, you can make it any way you like. You need a line going through this point. Well, you got a whole, and basically infinity of those lines. And sure, we know this that's just sort of basic geometry. Is that what he's after in saying there's no real necessity? What he's saying is that what we think to be necessity, which we actually take as a hallmark of mathematics, and of course of the most mathematized, the closest to mathematics of the scientific disciplines, physics, we often think that what we're working with is necessities. And, for example, when we're teaching logic, this is why I have this syllogism up here. If A, then B, A, therefore B. We would say, well, that's a necessity. That's just modus ponens, right? Is it necessary, though? Here's what we have to ask ourselves. Why A? Why this? Why did you actually put these two together? Why did you stress that? And so you can frame a larger thing outside of the situation and say, yeah, you're right. Once you actually have if A, then B, and you actually have A, then B has to follow from that. That's all fine. That's necessity. That's logical necessity right there. That's apodictic, if we want to use Kantian or even Aristotelian terminology in its modality. But why do you have to have this in the first place? Maybe if A, not always B. Maybe that's something that you're assuming so that you can make the processes that you want to work. Maybe that's something that is mathematically true, but you have to ask yourself, well, why did you set things up in the first place that way? And I'll give you a great example of this. I used to go to political science conventions, and I would go to these quantitative analysis sessions, which most of the stuff that they're doing in political science tends to be number crunching, data analysis. And I would go for the political theory, but that's a whole different conversation. So I would go to these things, and it would be on something that I was interested in, like, political movements in Europe. And then they would do, these analyses, and they would say, well, we've looked at these 38 political parties, and we've put them on this spectrum, and, we've got this five-point thing ranging from most conservative to most radical or most liberal, most progressive. And then they do some analysis using some very sophisticated statistical techniques, and then they would argue about why did you apply this statistical technique. And I would look at this and I'd be like, well, why the hell did you divide the data up that way anyway? I mean, this doesn't seem like that great of a fit. And every time I'd ask those sort of questions, they would give me blank stares and say, well, we just used this model that we found over here. And I said, well, why did you use that model? Why was that appropriate? The lack of sort of stepping back and
Mm,
reflexivity is what Hegel is criticizing as lack of necessity here. In order for something to really be exemplifying necessity for a rational subject, there has to be an answer to the higher order why.
mm, hmm.
And
Yeah, just real quick. It's just very interesting that a lot of, you know, and you see this especially like what you said in political science and economics too. Assume this is correct. If this is correct, then that means blah 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 blah. I'm like, wait, 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 wait. Why would you even assume this is correct in the first place? Like the whole idea with economics that people are rational. Assuming everybody's rational. You know, this idea that the rational buyer, and that holds that people will invest this way and consume that way, and this that what happened in the marketplace. I'm like, so you making all these predictions, and all the and not only predictions, but also based on those predictions, things like loan rates, interest rates, you know, uh, growth progression charts and everything like that. Like a lot of things are tied to these predictions of the charts, and all of that is based on some vapid assumptions, assuming that people are rational buyers. And we know for a fact that people are not rational buyers, whatever that means, or rather they're you have to redefine what you mean by rational, right? Because rational doesn't necessarily mean you're going to take the cheapest option or the most efficient option at any point. It means you're going to take one that resonates with you emotionally, right? That feels good to you, and that could be seen as a rational choice, but it's not the same type of rational choice that that the economists are saying. Right, so you have to look at these areas in which we say, oh, assume this for this to be correct, and that means blah 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 blah. Well, don't make that assumption in the first place. Like, who says you can make that assumption? So yeah, this is a great point to bring up.
he thinks that mathematical cognition is missing that.
Mm,
The evident character of this defective cognition of which mathematics is proud, and on which it plumes itself before philosophy, rests solely on the poverty of its purpose and the
mm,
defectiveness of its stuff, and is therefore of a kind that philosophy must spurn. Its purpose or notion is magnitude.
mm,
It is just this relationship that is unessential, lacking the notion. Accordingly, this process of knowing proceeds on the surface, does not touch the thing itself, its essence or notion, and therefore fails to comprehend it in terms of its notion. The material regarding which mathematics provides such a gratifying treasury of truths is space and numerical unit. Space is the existence in which the notion inscribes its differences, as in an empty, lifeless element, in which they are just as inert and lifeless. The actual is not something spatial, as it is regarded in mathematics. With non-actual things like the objects of mathematics, neither concrete sense intuition nor philosophy has the least concern.
mm,
In a non-actual element like this, there is only a truth of the same sort, that is, rigid, dead propositions. We can stop at any one of them. The next one starts afresh on its own account, without the first having moved itself on to the next, and without any necessary connection arising through the nature of the thing itself. Further,
mm.
because of this principle and
Long
element,
section.
and herein consists the formalism of mathematical evidence. This kind of knowing moves forward along the line of equality. For what is lifeless, since it does not move of itself, does not get as far as the distinction of essence, as far as essential opposition or inequality, and therefore does not make the transition of one opposite into its opposite, does not attain to qualitative immanent motion or self-movement.
Hmm.
For it is only magnitude, the unessential distinction, that mathematics deals with. It abstracts from the fact that it is the notion which divides space into its dimensions and determines the connections between and within them. It does not, for example, consider the relationship of line to surface. And when it compares the diameter of a circle with its circumference, when it runs up against their incommensurability, that is, a relationship of the notion, something infinite that eludes mathematical determination.
And they say all the time, like infinity in math means that your
In
maths are broken.
section 45, we
It means
now
something
start
is
to get
wrong.
closer to the heart of the matter.
But
And Hegel's
we have a lot of that in math, right? These infinities that say, oh, a point, a line is an infinite amount of points, and a circle's an infinite amount of angles, and or vertex or whatever. Um, like when you say you put in a tangent on a circle, well, why are you putting it there? Why does it go across that way? This, that, and the other. Um, I don't know. interesting way of looking at it.
Made a few important criticisms of a sort of over-reliance on mathematical cognition in doing philosophy and in attempting to make sense out of the world, the knowing subject, all these sorts of things. Now he's going to levy one of his main criticisms. And here's a place where I would actually suggest that it could be useful to go outside of the phenomenology proper. He has a similar set of discussions that are ongoing early on in the Science Logic. It's his first logic, not the encyclopedia, but the Science of Logic, which is the work that follows this one, where he's discussing quantity. And he's going to use somewhat similar analyses. He's going to frame it in somewhat different language, but it's really the same sort of criticism, only carried out a little bit more fully there. So he says that when it comes to mathematical cognition, it's purpose and notion. It's Zweck and Begriff. You notice we just talked about Zweck, end, purpose, goal, what it is, the reason, the motive, why you're actually doing it. He says that the purpose of mathematics is in fact magnitude, Größe in German, or quantity, if we want to express it that way, number. Now what does that mean? Well, mathematics wants to turn everything into number because that's what it can make sense out of. That's what is one of the problems with mathematical cognition. And its Begriff, its notion, its concept is an impoverished one because it's going to frame everything in terms of quantity and what you can do with quantities. And now, he's not knocking quantity. And as a matter of fact, if Hegel were around today and he was looking at what we can do with computer modeling, he'd be saying, or the advances we've made with statistics, he'd say, this is incredible. But it's still subject to the same ultimate critique. Hegel would, for example, be a great...
I know I said I wasn't going to posit that much, but this is just a great point because we see this same exact problem with data, right? With big data and algorithms and social media and all these big companies and even the economy in general. This idea that if you just have enough data, right? If you just have enough data points, just enough numbers, crunch the numbers enough, you can understand anybody, you can push anything, you can get people to pay for your product or whatever, Facebook. But as we see, numbers aren't everything, right? What matters is the quality behind it. What matters is the experience, right? Which can't really be quantified. The minute you try to quantify an experience is the minute in which you lose the point of the experience. And the very fact that even though Facebook is a huge company, billions of dollars, and yet people hate the company, it's kind of proof positive to me that numbers isn't everything. Furthermore, the fact that they're losing a whole bunch of customers on their, Facebook platform, and that's why they're trying to buy the metaverse. They're trying to take over the metaverse, right? It's because if you try to put all this just if you try to view the world as just numbers, as just quantities, in their case, ad revenue, right? Click-through rates, things like that, then you don't really get in it because again you're not understanding why, you're not understanding how, you're not understanding what is really going on. Yes, you can figure out a huge amount of information, right? You crunch enough data, you can get some amazing information on people, but that still doesn't really help you understand who those people are as people and how to build an experience for them or how to generally understand what makes a good social media or really a good social space and what makes a good just experience in general, which is more of the notion of existence, if you will. So yeah, it's such a great point to bring up, and it's even more kind of cogent today, or rather more appropriate today with all this big data and number crunching with AI stuff.
fan of Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem. He'd say, yes, of course.
Mm.
So what can we say about this? He says that the evident character of this defective cognition with which mathematics is proud. Mathematics has a tendency, and those who latch on to mathematics have a tendency to become a bit arrogant about its capacities to model, its capacities to apply,
Yes,
its
sir.
capacities to provide us with a basis for things. He says, rests solely on the poverty of its purpose, which is just to work with number. Mathematics is not able to take in, let's say we want to think about this in older terms, Aristotelian terms. Aristotle classed quantity as one of the accidents, and he thought it was an important thing. He didn't give as much stress to it as later philosophers like, say, Descartes or Spinoza would. But he thought that it was important. He talks about it in his Metaphysics. But he thought that something else was more fundamental, and here Hegel is fundamentally Aristotelian. Quality. topoion in Greek, Qualität in German. Quality, something determinative that goes
Right.
beyond mere mathematics, mere number, mere quantity, mere, statistical modeling, something which escapes that, not just in one dimension, but in multiple dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
That was what Aristotle thought was closer to being. Of course, he thought that substance was most real, and then quality, and then quantity, and then you've got all the other stuff as well. So quantity is important for Aristotle. Hegel has a mindset very much like that, except that quality and substance almost kind of switch roles back and forth because it's a dynamic system, not as static as Aristotle's admittedly dynamic system turns out to be. So he says, its purpose or notion is magnitude, and this is unessential, lacking the notion. So its concept is, in a certain sense, Hegelian concept-less. Its Begriff is begrifflos in German. So he says, accordingly, this process of knowing proceeds on the surface of things, does not touch the thing itself or its essence or its notion. So mathematics and mathematically based ways of approaching things, through, say, technology, through computers, through algorithms, can't really get to the heart of things.
Right.
They can do a lot, but they blind us to the fact that they're not actually getting to what's essential.
Mm-hmm.
And he says the reason is because its material is space and numerical unit. In the logic, he is going to speak in terms of discreteness and continuity rather than in terms of space and numerical unit, but it's really, working with similar stuff. There he'll have a, he'll distinguish space and continuity, but here we can sort of blend them together. So mathematics works with spatiality. It works with, arranging things in spatial terms. Think about, a three-dimensional grid, like Cartesian coordinates allow us to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's, mathematical space. And then numerical units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, add in all the other things, fractions, irrational numbers. Those are all mathematical units. And some of them may be defined in terms of relations to others, but they're all ultimately winding up being understood in terms of units and some sort of sequence. So he says, space is the existence in which the notion inscribes its differences in an empty, lifeless element. That's a problem. An empty, lifeless element rather than what we actually experience. So again, remember, we're dealing with a phenomenology here. We want to be attentive to what it is that we actually experience, what it is that we are actually conscious of. Are we ever conscious of empty space? No, that's an abstraction within which we place things, a useful one. But it is still an abstraction. Nothing actually exists in space. Everything exists in continuity with everything else and pushing on everything else. That's the way we experience reality. Even what we call empty space, we experience as, places where we can move around, do things. There's still relationality, there's still an experience there. It's not purely abstract and empty. Mm-hmm. And so he says, the actual is not something spatial, as it is regarded in mathematics. With non-actual things like the objects of mathematics, neither concrete sense intuition, neither the way in which we experience the world when we're not doing philosophy, when we're just engaged in the natural attitude, as Husserl called it, nor philosophy has the least concern. In a non-actual element like this, there's only a truth of the same sort, rigid, dead propositions. And this gets to the heart of what Hegel wants to say here. He says, mathematics and mathematical cognition focuses on equality, abstract equality, and it's not adequate to life. It's not adequate to lived experience. It's not adequate to the fullness of what something dynamic would actually be. So any mathematical model is going to be at best just a model. It's certainly not able to take into account self-movement, things that choose, at least in the sense of human subjects, choose what they're going to do, that grow, that develop, that decline, that engage in conflict. Some of this can, again, be modeled sort of in an asymptotic way by mathematics, but mathematics still remains on the superficial, on the surface of the things. So he says, what is lifeless, since it does not move of itself, does not get as far as the distinction of essence. Numbers are actually lifeless. Numbers do not move themselves. Numbers are not going to be an adequate means for understanding the realities that we're trying to make sense of. He says, they don't make the transition of one opposite into its opposite. That's something that, if you're going to do mathematics, you have to sort of leave behind. There are some exceptions, of course. The theory of limits has some interesting ideas along those ways if we're doing calculus. And, this is one of those places where we could say, well, Hegel, what about this, what about this, what about this? Well, let's just follow him on this. What he's saying, for the most part, does hold. You're not able to take account of quality in its metaphysical sense adequately through a metaphysics of quantity. And that's what mathematics, in effect, is a metaphysics of quantity. So he says, you can't attain to qualitative immanent motion or self-movement, for its only magnitude, the unessential distinction. When he says unessential distinction, he doesn't mean totally unessential, but not getting at the real heart of the thing, not getting at what we want to be studying through going through the phenomenology of consciousness and its development through history and time. So he says, it abstracts from the fact that it is the notion which divides space. It is the concept in its full sense, in the living sense, embodied in subjects, which actually does divide space, which gives spatiality meaning. This is a very, very important point, something that we'll come back to in later parts of the phenomenology. So he says, and determines the connections between and within them. It does not, for example, consider the relationship of line to surface, and when it compares, and he's got some examples here, it runs up against incommensurability. Incommensurability is a relationship of the notion. Now, where we could actually pause here would be to think, well, what about, like, the paradoxes of set theory, or what about some of Cantor's reflections on transfinite numbers? Okay, again, once again,
I don't know what that
we
is.
have areas where maybe Hegel didn't have as much of the mathematics as we do now, and the question that we have to ask is, could he actually embrace that and bring it within the systematic perspective that he's looking at here, and say, well, in that respect, mathematics actually is involving a sort of concept? Or would he go further and say, look, Cantor is a subject. The people doing the paradoxes of set theory, they're not set theory itself. They are living, vital subjects that are engaging in this through the processes of lived rationality and experience and cognition. I think he would go with the latter. So this is an important part of his criticism of mathematical cognition, but it's not the entire thing. And now we're going to have to proceed further into this.
Oh, very interesting. So in order to prove him wrong, you would have to find instances of math kind of being living, if you will, as in, self-perpetuating, self-propagating, or maybe, um, I wonder if people found something like that, because people love to say, oh, or some, lovers of math, they say, oh, it's a universalist language. It's, this thing that might exist even separate from us, from humans. But I don't know about that. Like, yeah, I understand it seems like that a lot of times, and we can explain a whole lot with it. But you have to wonder if another species, right, another intelligent life would be able to understand our math, right, or they have their own understanding of the world. It's impossible to really say unless we find another species and see what happens. Um, it's one of those things that you just gotta wait and see, because you can postulate as much as you want, but until you have that proof, till you have that other alien life form, where we can compare notes. You can't really say much, unfortunately. Well, can't say much conclusively. You can say a whole lot, but you can't say it conclusively. Um, but anyways, very interesting stuff. Interested to get on down to the rest of this. As always, thanks for listening. Um, thanks for watching, and feel free to let me know your own thoughts on this subject or any others. I'm tired, so sorry for the low energy of this video, but we'll get back to it next week, and I'm glad to have done this anyways. So, yeah, have a great day. Have a great weekend. See ya. Bye bye.